Yeah, my great grandfather, William Henry Harrison Clayton, was a federal judge and a federal prosecutor in Arkansas and in eventually in Oklahoma. And he was one of four brothers who grew up in Pennsylvania from an old Quaker family. Their last name was Clayton. That's who I was named after. There was my ancestor, and then he had a twin brother, John Clayton, the oldest brother, surviving brother. The whole family, there were more than four, but a lot of them passed away as farm kids were apt to do back in those days. And this is in the early 19th century. There were originally 10 people in the family, and only four of them made it to adulthood, which is kind of sad when you think about it. But there were four brothers. There was my ancestor, his identical twin brother. The oldest brother was Thomas Clayton, who ended up becoming a federal judge, or excuse me, he was a state judge in Pennsylvania. And then Powell Clayton was the second brother. And Powell Clayton is probably the most famous of the four, even though all four of them became historical figures for one reason or another. But Powell had a special ambition. Powell left Pennsylvania. He was the first of the brothers to leave. He left back in the 1850s and went to Kansas. We don't know exactly what he was doing in Kansas, but I've always thought, based on my research and reading, that Powell, out of all of them, was probably the most adamantly anti slavery of the four brothers. All of them were, I think, and three of them, all except for Thomas Jefferson Clayton, served in the Union Army in the Civil War. But Powell, as history bore out, did a lot to support the advancement of the freed slaves after the Civil War. But at any rate, he distinguished himself in the Civil War itself. After the war began in Kansas, he raised a company of soldiers, and he was made captain. Eventually, I think he started as maybe a lieutenant, but he had received some military training over the years. He was an engineer, so he was definitely qualified to lead a company at least. And so he became a captain and was part of the first Kansas Regiment. One of the early battles in the Western theater of the Civil War was the Battle of Wilson's Creek. That was in Missouri. And Missouri at the time was kind of up for grabs between the Confederates and the Union Army. And there was a major battle that occurred at Wilson's Creek. It probably involved close to 10, 20,000 troops altogether. What happened, though, is that Powell's company and his regiment, the 1st Kansas, probably suffered more casualties than any other regiment in the battle. And it was a hard fought battle. They were the 1st Kansas regiment was actually in the front lines. And then what happens is that at one point, after long struggle, the regiment is ordered to pull back. There's a ridge that separated the Union's army from the Confederates, and the regiment was at the top of the ridge. And so, after a certain amount of time, they're ordered to retreat. Unfortunately, there was so much confusion, battle smoke, gun smoke, and probably fog maybe from the creek where they were fighting, that the troops weren't really able to see very far. And through confusion, Powell's company actually moved forward instead of moving back, retreating with the rest of the regiment. And so they're actually out in the open with no support. And what happens is that they eventually, as they're moving forward in the battle, they reach a group of other soldiers, and this is towards the beginning of the Civil War, so the uniforms weren't real uniform. The troops weren't, as it turned out, one side wore gray, the other side wore blue. But at the beginning of the war, it was a little unclear, so you really couldn't tell who was friend and who was foe. And they saw a group of men clad in blue-gray uniform. They thought they were Union troops, but once they approached, Powell was able to see who the commander was of this group, and he recognized him as somebody he knew from Leavenworth, Kansas, and he knew that this guy was a Confederate. So immediately, Powell had his troops begin edging away because he knew that they were outnumbered and that they were surrounded, basically, and that they were going to have to retreat. But Powell, thinking fast, asked a Confederate soldier who's approaching them whether he was a Confederate or with the United States. The guy says, "Well, I'm Confederate," and then Powell immediately grabs him and takes him into custody and pulls out his pistol and points it at the guy's head, keeping him in between the group of Confederate, who they knew now are Confederates, and his own troops who are starting to retreat. And he told the guy, "Don't say anything to your troops or else you're dead." Now, this guy, for whatever reason, didn't listen to Powell, and he actually he ordered his soldiers to start firing. Powell immediately shot the guy, and the guy on the ground is bayoneted by another one of Powell's troops. And then all hell breaks loose. And Powell, through his quick actions, was able to at least get most of his troops out of that horrible situation, and they retreated, and they were, for the most part, saved, although of course many of them did die, and they suffered a very high casualty rate, but they weren't captured, and a good part of the company survived. And for his actions, Powell was made a lieutenant colonel after that battle, and eventually he worked himself from lieutenant colonel up to brigadier general, because this was early in the war, and Powell again distinguished himself in several other of the battles that were fought in the Western Theater. The Western Theater isn't as well documented as the Eastern Theater, which is where General Lee and all the Union generals were fighting the battles around Virginia at the beginning of the war. But the Western Theater was also very important, and it was documented. What I just read is from a book about Powell Clayton. And that story is not just a story. That was contemporaneously recorded because they kept regimental histories, and they interviewed troops, shortly after the battles or conflicts that they were involved in, to make sure that they knew who had performed well and who hadn't performed well. Well, Powell Clayton worked himself up from captain to brigadier general by the end of the Civil War. And by the end of the Civil War, he was pretty well known too, because had compiled a very good record of service to the Union Army, and also was very well respected by many of the people in Arkansas who, he was technically, the conquering figure. But he was able to conduct the occupation of Arkansas so well that he received a lot of plaudits from not just the Union people but the Confederate people. They at least respected him. So what happened is that Powell Clayton stayed in Arkansas after the Civil War, and he eventually became the governor of Arkansas. He was the first elected Reconstruction governor. Now, the way the elections were, though, in the immediately after the Civil War, there was an occupying force, and I believe the first elections were in 1868. And what happened is that anybody who served in the Confederate Army was prohibited from voting in the elections. They had to get a special pardon, because when you think about it, every single soldier in the Confederate Army was guilty of treason. And technically, back then, these people could have been executed. They weren't all executed. That would have just been a needless slaughter of people. But they were prohibited from voting, and probably for good reason, because think about it. Who are they going to vote for after the Civil War? With freed slaves and other people. They're going to vote for the people who are going to be against giving rights to any of the freed slaves, or against anybody that would allow any sort of progress in the state. So Powell Clayton ends up getting elected, and eventually he becomes a very powerful figure in the Republican Party in Arkansas. And another thing that he had to deal with as the first Reconstruction governor in Arkansas was the Ku Klux Klan. Because after that election in 1868, all these disgruntled former Confederate soldiers who no longer even had the right to vote began organizations that were designed to undermine the new governments and the newly freed slaves, take away all their rights. And of course, the first and the most famous of those organizations was the Ku Klux Klan. And they basically planned and executed, coordinated almost, in all of the former Confederate states, a guerrilla war against all the newly elected governments. That happened in the, from 1868 till about 1872. And Powell, though, was ready for the Klan. Powell had organized a militia. He had a militia ready to defend his government against the Ku Klux Klan before they even started their formal uprising against the government. Powell himself had been the subject of at least 3 to 4 assassination plots, which are documented in the book as well. He was chased. There's one story about how after he leaves the legislature in Little Rock, Arkansas, he's basically chased through the streets by these thugs, where he pulls out a pistol and basically stands him down and, was able to save his own life. But he knew what the Klan was up to. And I think a lot of the smart Union people knew, the smart people in the government knew. So he was ready. He actually organized a state militia, had them in different regiments throughout the state of Arkansas. So when the Klan started all its guerrilla activities, he declared martial law in the state of Arkansas, and then basically went to war against the Ku Klux Klan and kicked their butts. Powell Clayton, unlike in some of the other southern states, the Klan didn't really achieve much success in Arkansas. Powell Clayton beat them at their own game and was able to at least maintain his government until later on. And of course, we all know what happened in the South after 1876 when, the Klan influence became a lot stronger, and a lot of the old Confederates just went right back into power and took away the right to vote on the part of many of the freed slaves, which changed everything. Because when Powell was elected, he had the votes of all the newly free black voters that had the right to vote under the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So he was able to maintain peace in the state as much as was possible back then. Eventually, he became a United States Senator, and later in his career, he became the first ambassador to the first formal ambassador to the country of Mexico. That was when Teddy Roosevelt was president. And one of the other things that Powell Clayton did as a leader of the Republican Party in the state of Arkansas was he had a lot of control over patronage in the federal, at least even after Reconstruction failed. He had the Republican Party still had a lot of power in Arkansas because of the federal appointments. And that's, I think that's one of the reasons my ancestor, his brother, ended up becoming the United States, or the district attorney, the United States district attorney in the Western District of Arkansas, and a federal judge, because Powell had a lot of influence over the various Republican presidents who were in charge of appointing people to the federal spots in Arkansas and eventually in Oklahoma or the Indian Territory. But Powell Clayton was truly an historical figure. I think I'm really proud to be one of his indirect descendants, and also a direct descendant of the Clayton family. And I think we all have a lot to be proud of.